Righty, so should be showing a record at your end as well. Um,
Yep.
so, so I've just been feeling trying to remind Isabel of the last time that I spoke to her 30 years ago when I was in high school and loving the Obed Newton. Well, I think only the first two books of the Chronicles were out then, and my best friend and I just absolutely loved them. And I was the English teacher's pet. And so I said, can you please get Isabel to come and, talk to the class? And so you did. And then you came to my house and I got to do just a one-on-one conversation with you, which was so special. And then I was talking with a friend recently who mentioned that he's been actually listening to your books on Audible. And so that's what I've now been doing. And amazing that not only are you an absolute incredible writer, but you are such a good audio reader as well. Far out. You're just such a woman of many talents. So I've
Thank you.
been really loving going back over the Chronicles and back into the world of Elspeth and your wonderful reading, which has been such a pleasure. And the other reason I wanted to talk to you, Isabel, is because I have a blog and I just write about life and stuff. I do not have the skill to be a fantasy writer, so I just write about life. And what I'm doing at the moment is a series where I've been going through the artist's way, chapter by chapter and
I
writing
know.
about it
Yeah.
in each sort of installment. And so I thought it would be really interesting to talk to you about the creative process. And I've jotted down a few questions, but I imagine that, we'll just let the conversation go where it's going to go. But something that I think is really fascinating about you, having gone back and listened to a couple of interviews that you've done on YouTube and having a look at your Wikipedia write-up and your website, how prolific you are. And I've heard the story of you getting published for the first time and how it all just sort of fell into place. And I just thought that was really interesting because often the story with creatives is it's a battle and there's a lot of self-doubt to overcome and there's a lot of, U-turns and procrastination. And certainly that's a big part of my story. But for you, it seems different. And one thing that I noticed, which was really interesting, is that for you, writing is an obsession. And I thought that was really interesting. So obviously when something's an obsession, you just want to be doing it all the time. And being distracted by other things or feeling like you should clean the kitchen or do whatever is not a problem because the thing that you want to be doing is what your craft is. So I would just love you to talk to me a bit about how that experience is for you as a creative and a writer and an obsessive writer.
It's interesting. I think it probably goes back. There's a couple of bits to talk about. I started when I was 14, so um, I was the eldest of 8 kids, and I used to tell stories to my brothers and sisters, basically to keep them under control when my mum was working. So there was that aspect of storytelling. I was a storyteller from the beginning, and I liked doing it. And I understood about audience because I had the worst kind of audience in front of me. So I didn't have to ever think about them when I grew up and became, started to write. I don't think about the audience at all because it's obvious that there's an audience there to me. And the age of an audience isn't relevant to me very much. I mean, if you are talking to your family in the kitchen and one of them is 7 and one of them is 70, you don't really talk very differently to them. You just might change your language slightly, maybe even. And so I don't think very much about that. I think more about the character that I'm writing. I'm working through the character. I'm seeing the story through the character's eyes, and the authenticity of the character to make it real for me has to be there. So if the person's old or the person's young, I have to feel that age or that youth when I'm writing. The thing about housework makes me laugh because last night I was arguing about washing the dishes, meaning I wanted to wash the dishes, and my daughter's boyfriend was trying to wash them. And I said, "Look, I know this is going to sound weird, but when I'm doing the dishes, I can think."
Yeah.
And that's the other really, really important bit about writing is that only part of it happens consciously, and the other part happens sort of unconsciously while you're not working, while you're doing all the 1,000 other things. It's why when if you've got an idea that goes really deep, and they must in order to really engage this process, if you've got a question you're pursuing, and for me, it always contains questions, writing. If you've got a question you're pursuing, it's got to be a deep one, and it's in you anyway. And some of it is conscious, and you're kind of fiddling with it and working on it. And then you need to let it go away from you a little bit. And that washing the dishes or going for a walk or doing some kind of like mundane activity. When I draw one thing, I'm often thinking about something quite different. So that allows that part of my mind to be free to work. So the thing about housework or anything, it's kind of, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. At some level, I'm writing. And I think everybody who writes has that happen, even if you're writing about reality directly, because I'm also always writing about reality. Even when you're writing about reality directly, you're not thinking about it all of the time. And there's sometimes when you might go pick your kids up from school or sleep, or go and shop, come home, sit down, or the next day especially, you start to write and suddenly it's there. You've come several steps forward, or your idea is more fully rounded. So for me, it's the way I process life. I mean, it's probably very irritating to the people around me, but I mean, I know it's irritating sometimes to people because they tell me so, that I think in words that are outside of me. So the thinking that goes on inside my mind, the best thinking is the deep thinking, which is unconscious. And the rest of the time, if I'm trying to think something through, sometimes I'm talking it aloud in order to know what I'm thinking or to work it out. And writing is just a much deeper way to do that, to think clearly. So that's how it is. Why I call it obsessive. I really mean that it's not something that I think of as the thing that I do that's work, that I have to somehow prepare for. And I know that inspiration does not come when you're about to write. You don't wait for it. You sit down, you work, and while you're working, inspiration will come. It comes much more easily if the questions you're asking with your writing are deep. And I'm sure that's exactly the same for you as a writer of more realistic material. It would be the same for you. When you strike a vein that's deep, suddenly you have no trouble writing at all. It's when you're struggling, I think that's the time to stop and ask yourself questions. And I think about this a lot, the need to ask yourself questions. If you're struggling with a scene, the question should be, what am I trying to say here? Why am I writing this? Why am I writing this character? Why have I made the character this age? And if you don't have answers to those things, you haven't thought well enough about the thing before you've written it. For me, you think about something for a really long time. I do anyway, before I write. And I don't make notes, because the minute we start to put down notes, we set in concrete, because we're lazy. We set in concrete the product we're going to write, the thing we're going to write. It's really hard for us to change the order, the age, the anything. But if you've got it in your mind, it remains fluid and malleable and porous. So the longer you can keep it up there, until you literally can't bear not to keep it up there any longer, until it gets in the way of everything. Until when you're standing in the shopping queue, you're thinking about it, until you're having an argument with someone and it's kind of in the back of your mind, until you're watching a television program and you think, I could use that bit. So when it's like that, where it takes over and it's taking up everything like an attractor, then it's ready to be written. And sometimes that can be years for me. 15 years can go by with an idea I've never written down, and longer, I have to say. Things I know that one day I'll write, but other things I forget, like everybody. Have this idea and I think, oh, that would be a great idea. And the next day I can't remember it. I think, oh well, because it's in there. We know that almost everything we think and see is still in there. And if it is good enough, it will accrue to something else, or it will gain weight and come back again, or it will be merging with something else. So I just have to have faith in that as well. So that's kind of the process.
Thanks, Isobelle. You said so many interesting things that I wanted to go off on a tangent on, and hopefully I can remember them all. Yeah, you said a few things that were very interesting. The one thing that I want to touch on first of all is um, showing up and doing the work in order for the creative inspiration to come. And I've a lot of people write about that. It seems like pretty much all creatives talk about it that way. And can you say a bit more about what you think the creativity, the inspiration is? Where does it come from? Can you talk to me a bit more about that?
I think it's a deepening of the question. Like for me, when I write, for me, it comes in three parts. Usually, something is troubling me about the world and making me anxious and worried. My first book began after my dad was killed in a car accident. So I'm sure I spoke about that to you back when you were young. So that was the trigger for all of my anxieties about justice, about death, so some really big questions were there for me back then. And so when I write, there's something that's bothering me. When I was writing my most recent book, what I was worried about was misinformation. How can we ever solve any of the world's problems if we can't even agree on anything? And also, control, protest control and all kinds of controls, those things, surveillance and all of these things were troubling me, are troubling
Absolutely.
me.
Yes, I'm with you there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they make me worried. And in order to think about them, I do think about them, of course, and I can't help it. I'm drawn to programs that kind of explore the thing that's bothering me, as anybody does. I'm sort of looking for information in the world to understand it better, to see if I can get some traction somehow, because those things that scare you, you feel powerless against. And one of the ways to gain power is knowledge. And knowledge gives you traction, a place where you can stand and push back if you can, or stand steady. So I'm looking for that in a way, in the questions, something to stand on, something I believe in that will help me deal with the feeling of helplessness and that feeling of anxiety. And then at some point a character steps up. And with The Gathering, I'm sure I must have mentioned then how Nissa and Nathaniel just stepped up when I was, funnily enough, there's train lines going right by this apartment. I'm in Italy right now. When I booked it, I thought it was a sea view, and I was amazed. I got here and there was a sea of trains out there. It's actually a great apartment and I really love it, but there are trains. And on that occasion, I was riding into the back of Melbourne on a train, and I saw these two young people talking really earnestly in a place where no kids could possibly be allowed, in the train yard. And suddenly the boy was talking very earnestly to the girl, and she just punched him as hard as she could in the stomach, and he bent over, and I couldn't hear anything. He bent over and then he just went on talking, and they both went on talking and that was the moment in which Nissa and Nathaniel were born. So the essence of those two characters were in that. And that often happens. There's something happens which produces the character, and that's the vessel to carry my questions. So the vessel has to be the right vessel. So the character has to be there, and I have to know what the name of the thing is before I've started before now, when I thought I had a name, but I didn't feel 100% sure about it. And it didn't work until the name was changed to the correct name. So the name is really important to me as well. So, wow, I've lost track of it myself now. Remind me of your question again so I can catch the track.
So my question was the contrast between showing up to, sit down and write and do the work, and the creative inspiration that comes through that, I've heard a lot of people talk about as a muse, or, coming from elsewhere. And so that was my question. So that's where this all started.
Yeah, so I suppose the question is the provoking aspect, or it's the bit of grit that starts to form the pearl, but it takes time. And I know, and usually I try and build up a head of steam. When I was young, I didn't do it on purpose. Now I really do it. I know that I need input times and output times. This is an input time. It's like I've been on the road for a month with my mum, my 84-year-old mum. She's just gone home. I'm here for a week with my daughter and her boyfriend, and I can't wait to write. I can't wait. It's pouring out of me everywhere. Every time I sit down somewhere now, it's starting to come out of me. And I know, look, I want, my birthday's coming and I want to be above the Arctic Circle for that. And I want to start writing for a week up in Narvik or something in Norway. So, you know, that's my plan. So, and I know that I'm so full to bursting of wanting to write. And I have two short stories I'd like to write. I have a novel I'm meant to be working on, which is so big I can't be working on it while I'm on the road. But I know I need to start writing now. So that urge is there. It's a really strong urge. And yet, you know, the moment you sit down, even with all that pressure behind you, you still have to do the prosaic business of sitting down and starting to write. And honestly, it doesn't matter what you write. You just have to open the floodgates and just be patient and work, and it will start to come, especially if it's something you've been thinking a lot about. Have you ever heard this term Peter Carey uses, cantilevering?
I haven't.
Yeah, I read this and I think this is how I work too. And a lot of people work this way. So you start the thing and you know it's not right, and you start and start and start. And then you think, oh, and then you go back again and you start again. But you go a bit further forward and you've developed it a bit more. And then you stop and you start again and you go a bit. And it's, you can't do that endlessly. You can't do that deep in your book. But that's often the way he talks about beginning. And for me, it's like that too. I'll start, and I couldn't help myself the other day when I was here alone for a couple of hours. I started to write, and then I stopped and thought, okay, no. And I know when I sit down now, I will not go on from where I left off. I will go back to the beginning again and get another run up. And probably it'll take 2 or 3 of those before I feel the opening. And it's really just pushing at those floodgates to get them open so that I can move forward. And all of that work I've done in my mind beforehand is behind that gate waiting to come out. So that helps too. It's probably all just mythical, you know, ritual. And I'm very into ritual. I've got to find the right, because I handwrite to begin with.
Yeah.
I've got to find the right pen and the right ink. And sometimes I mix the color of ink to get exactly the right.
Do you? So do you use
it's
like
just
a fountain
ritual.
Pen to write with? Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you have a favorite sort of paper to write on?
It's different with every book, but the one that I've always loved the most, they seem to have stopped printing, is a thing called White Lines. It's a Swiss paper with orange glue along the side. It comes in a really big block, and it's slightly grey paper with white instead of black or grey lines. And I really, really like it. Otherwise, I write on paper without lines, and I put lined paper behind it. So that's
a good idea.
There's the obsession.
So why is that? Is there some superstition behind it, or is it just something that makes you feel comfortable?
I think it's just an aesthetic thing. It pleases me. I also draw, and it somehow goes into that aspect of me. I like the feel of certain papers. Like when I draw, I like a paper that has a slight drag. I don't want it too smooth. Even when I'm using like really thin, scratchy little nibs like the end of a spider claw. I still want the paper to be a bit scratchy, which the problem with that is it splatters the ink everywhere, but I still like it. I like the feel of it is important.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, thanks, Isobelle. That is interesting. Another thing that I wanted to go back to talk about was, so I told you at the start, I don't feel like I've got the skill to write fantasy. I've tried and I'm just not good at it. I'm much better at writing about real life. And for me, I do find that it's a way of pondering, of trying to answer big questions, of probably exploring myself, exploring the world. I don't mean to do it, but that's what I do. And I sometimes feel like on my blog, oh God, here I go writing about myself again. And I think, oh, I hope that my readers aren't too bored. But then at the end of the day, it just is what it is. And I'm interested to hear that for you, fantasy you're doing the same thing. So you're exploring questions in your, trying to find answers to the big questions. And it's interesting because I actually prefer to read fantasy. I'm not a huge fan of nonfiction to read, although that's what I feel like my skill is in writing. But reading, I am a fiction and fantasy and sci-fi lover. And for me, I find it much more profound than reading, for example, just a straight out nonfiction spiritual book. I find quite boring. I find that it doesn't engage my brain. But when I'm off in a story in another world, it engages me and in a really profound way that I can relate back to this world. And it answers big questions for me. I often have aha moments in the middle of fiction. And it's fascinating because I think I assumed that fantasy or fiction writers, it's like something that's separate to their experience of life and they're creating this whole different world that doesn't have anything to do with this life. But obviously, that's not the case at all, is it? And that's fascinating.
Oh, you said so many interesting things in those statements. I think it's it's lovely to hear some of the things you've said too, because it's quite often people who don't write fantasy and who don't read it often think it's got nothing to do with reality. And a lot of bad fantasy does have, nothing at all to do with reality. And it's just filled with a lot of tropes. So people, and a lot of people who love it, write it, try to write it, and are not very good at it. And that goes back again to that question before that I was saying you need to ask yourself. I often ask them when I'm working or mentoring with someone, why are you writing fantasy? Because sometimes I just can tell they would be much better writing realism. I read a lot of realism, not realist. I don't read fact much unless I'm looking for specific facts. I tend to read a percentage of both. Have you read anything of Elizabeth Strout's?
No.
She's written the Lucy Barton series. So like she's a very, very fine writer. She wrote, you might know of it as a series. She wrote Oliver Kitteridge. And she's a very, very fine. I've just finished a book of hers, and I read All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy recently too. And they're quite realistic novels, beautifully, beautifully, tightly written. And every time I read one of those kinds of books that are so well written, I'm just kind of transported by them. And your aha moments happen to me then too. If I'm reading good fantasy, very good fantasy, those questions might come to me then too, but it's got to be good. And there's a lot of it out there that's quite competently, quite nicely written, but to me, it doesn't go deep. Like I need a writer to go very deep when they write fantasy. For instance, I think what's her first name? R-O-B-B, Robin Hobb. Robin Hobbs. Have you read anything of hers? Okay, she's a very fine writer of fantasy. She's written quite a lot of series. She's a really interesting woman, really good writing. Charles DeLint, who wrote, you might know of his, the Fionnevar Tapestry, I think he wrote. Oh, no, Guy Gavriel Kay wrote that. Charles DeLint did things like Moonheart. Guy Gavriel Kay did the Fionnevar Tapestry, which is exquisite. And so, there's some really fine fantasy out there, but the balance of it is, there's a lot of quite good fantasy, and then there's a little bit of really great fantasy. So I read across the board. I did my PhD on exactly this question you're asking, which is why at 14 did I default? That's the question I was exploring with my PhD. Why did I default to writing about a girl in a post-apocalyptic world? Why did I write science fantasy instead of just a straight out realism when I was a girl grieving for her dad who'd been killed in a car accident? Why did I default to that? I don't know why, but some of the techniques I use began back then. And when I was doing my PhD, you constantly have to narrow things down and narrow your question. So this big question, why did I write fantasy, came down to a particular technique that I think Ursula Le Guin uses. And she is my literary heroine. I think she's the finest writer. I'm just listening to the Earthsea Chronicles again, and they're just so tight and so beautifully written. And they're a lesson. Every time I read them, you are very much a reader's writer, because meaning you read as a writer. and you take inspiration from it. And I do the same thing. It feeds me somehow, and some things feed me really well. And when she writes tightly. And a technique that I was writing about, funnily enough, your question, I was writing my PhD, and it's a PhD where you write a novel and you explore an aspect of craft. And the bit I was trying to look at was a particular technique I use. And I thought, I can't just talk about myself. I need to show I need to be able to show this in someone else's work. So I wrote also about, I explored Ursula Le Guin's work. I went to Oregon, I looked through her papers, her letters, and all the rest of it. And I ended up being asked to cut the entire segment out of my PhD because I'd written such an enormous PhD. And we both knew, my supervisor and I, that it would take me years to finish it if I had to condense it. She said, why don't you just cut that section out? And I said, because I need to prove my thesis. And she said, you do it. You don't need another writer. So, but the technique we both use, and then the one that I kind of finally named and explored, was that I think as writers, you are talking about being a realist writer. I used to talk about being a writer of speculative fiction, but I don't think that's true of either of us now. I think what we do is we choose one tool and it works better for us. In the same way that if you go in the kitchen and someone's giving you some newfangled Thermomix like me, you can't figure out how to use it, but your old batter,
I'm not a fan of gadgets either,
which makes good sauces, is the one you always go for. So I think for you and I, the questions we want to explore are best served by the tool we reach for most often. And for you, that might be the realist tool. And for me, it might be the fantastic tool. But in fact, writers use both of them all the time. You do too. You wouldn't, I haven't read your writing, but if you read someone like Tim Winton, he does. And Margaret Atwood, she uses it. So they write realism, but they also, every now and again, there's the strangeness that comes in, or they're writing about something a little bit weird, and everyone says, oh, so now they're trying fantasy or something. No, they find a thing they want to write about that requires the tool they don't use very often. And sometimes when I'm talking to people who are writing fantasy badly, what they need is a bit of realism in their writing. And for me, when I'm imagining, and every writer who's inventing a world, you have to make it real. And the only way to make it real is to use the tool of realism inside the piece of writing. So it's just that you haven't yet had a question that you couldn't answer with reality, but it may well come sometime. And then there may be one day when you're writing about something real that happens to you, and you start to daydream about something, what if something, and all of a sudden you find you're writing about you discussing your death with an angel or something, because that's a question. And with my PhD, I wrote a novel called The Theatre of Death. And what I was exploring was how grieving is kind of like a land you have to cross. And, that maybe you never cross it. And that you're always crossing the land of grief if someone really close to you dies. And so that book was looking at that. And the reason I chose death as the subject matter was because to use both of those tools and to show how you use the tools of realism back and forwards, is because death is something that's a fact we will all have to face. We all know we're going to die. That's the one thing we know about life. No matter how rich, how many golden swan taps you have in your stupid mansion, you are still going to die. We're all going to die.
Each day, yes, we are.
Yeah, and so it's the most real thing we know, and yet none of us is going to come back and talk about it. No one's ever come back and said it was like this. They might say I had an after-death experience. No, you did, because you're still here. That was not death, because death is over. And so I wrote about this because I thought it is the perfect topic to write about, the oscillation of the use of the fantastic tool and the realist tool, because it's something that will always only be fantasy for us as well at the same time. So I think it is a tool, and I think if you think of it that way, you don't feel I can't do this. You just think I haven't needed that tool yet. But I think what is good for us, you and me, is to occasionally stretch ourselves by using the other tool, because when you do need it, if you need it in some slight way, like look at Tim Winton's Cloud Street, he uses it so effectively in separating the half of the boy who almost drowns into a kind of a disembodied voice, and leaving what remains of him inside the character. Brilliant.
Mm,
How could he have said what he said with those two characters any other way? It was gives me goosebumps, that
mm,
decision. And he writes absolute realism really, really well. And then he diverges into it. And of course, the reason a lot of people who write fantasy are, um, after writing a lot of realism, are good at it is because they've got the realist tool. They can make that world real. What they might not be good at is, why are you writing fantasy? There's got to be a reason. Like with Tim, that
yeah,
decision was because he wanted to say something which he couldn't say in any other way. And for me, many times the questions I'm exploring are much easier to explore with the fantastic tools
mhm,
than with realist tools. But I have written realism too. There are things I've written. I'm often asked, really often these days, because I'm old, even my daughter, who I think would be the last person who would want to read it, said to me, why don't you write a memoir? Why don't you write about your life?
yeah,
I don't want to. I lived it. I don't
mm,
want to have to do that, to go back through all that again and sift through the cupboard and like, no,
yeah,
no, I would hate that so much. Because also it's the golden goose. We
mm,
draw on our lives all the time, like you do and I do, because that's the only person we know this deeply, ourselves, and our
mm,
own experiences of life that we can draw on. They're the only things we can use. And to write about my life, I feel like I would be emptying my own creative cauldron and having nothing left. So
mm,
I would hate to do that.
mm. That's interesting. I actually do love also to read memoir. It's the only kind of realistic fiction that
I liked
I
it too.
writing that I like to read. But that's a very interesting point.
I
And
like memoir a lot too.
yeah, in fact, as I get older, I like more and more to read memoir. Um, so there are two big questions that are rolling around my head. So the first one is, so writing fantasy fiction, and in particular fantasy, as a different um, skill set. To me, it still feels so far away because in my head, when I think about it, I think there's so many moving parts that I'm really am in awe of good fiction writers, because you've got all the characters and then you've got the world building. And to me, it just feels like, wow, so vast. Talk to me a little bit about how you do that, because for me, when I think about doing it, it just feels like so many plates moving in the air, and and to do it well, you've obviously got to really develop the characters, and they've got to, be three-dimensional, and they've got to, interact and work together. But then you've got the world and the context that they exist within. And to me, my mind just goes, oh, that's just so much.
I was on stage once with George R. Martin, and he had exquisite maps which he'd drawn himself, like really detailed maps and genealogies and all that. And I was going on stage
Mm,
after him. This was back before the movies and stuff with
mm,
HBO happened. But when I was on stage with him, watching him unfold this stuff, I felt exactly what you're saying at the moment. Oh my God,
mm.
I do not write like that. And
Okay.
people
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
When I run classes of world building, I do
Mm,
not approach them in this way at all, because I think it's so separate from the question I want to ask.
okay.
It's like painting the room when you want to write. Like, I
Mm,
don't want to paint the room before I write. I want to paint. I want to sit down and write. So for me, it starts really with a character, usually one character, and it's the character that stepped up to carry the question. And I don't know what the world really looks like until they start moving through it and doing
okay.
things. And then I see it through their eyes. So with Elspeth, you know, it starts, in a quite rural setting. I read a lot of, fiction when I was a kid, and the forests of my childhood were not Australian forests. They were the forests of Narnia and of, Lord of the Rings and this kind of thing. So that was the kind of forest I imagined. And for me, the world is only an extension of the character in a way, and what the character is feeling, literally sometimes. For instance, when Elspeth is in a coach traveling through the mist, it's because I'm depressed and she's depressed, and we don't know what the hell's happening, and we don't know what's going to happen to us. I felt that as a kid very strongly, lost, and that lostness is carried by the Elspeth character, and the landscape reflects it. And when she gets to the Red City at the kind of at the ends of the series, and she's moving into the city, I don't know much about the city except the buildings are red and kind of, stone or mud or something. I don't know. And she steps into that city and she looks around and things start to happen. And as they're happening, I'm inside her seeing them. So I see a tower. So later on, I think, okay, well, she must have seen that from back there. So I need to write that in earlier. So there's a certain amount of stuff that happens in the editing phase, but the first phase is the character moving forward in the action of the story, carrying the question and what's going on inside her mind and her interactions with other characters. They're really important, and the world is just painted lightly in around. And then as I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, that's when I then start to flesh out all of the other stuff around the characters, or trim them, or slim it down or cut them. I've never been, I know I write really big books, but I've never been a padder. I don't pad anything. It's always a matter of trying to condense it down once it's all there. But it's because I write in this way. It's other people do some of that organizing inside their head before they write. I can't do that. I need the words to be there on the page. And I'm really in favor, and not everybody, of course, works this way, but I'm really in favor of just getting it down on the page. And then you've got the shape of the entire thing to work with. If you don't have it on the page, if you're starting and you're honing on the first paragraph and you're trying to perfect the world in the first paragraph, I just don't think you'd ever go forward unless you're George R.R. Martin. I mean, he's a brilliant writer and he does it the exact opposite way that I'm saying now. So I think there are ways that work for you, and finding a way, to write. For me, it's often, in one of the short stories I wrote, in Green Monkey Dreams, I wondered what would happen if an angel was a destroyer. What if an angel came to destroy? What would happen? What would they be? Angelic? Would they be monstrous? What kind of person would that be? And imagining that character, I didn't know what the city it's called the Glory Days, that city, and he goes into the city of glory. Or the character is a sort of a girl, because she's young and can get into this city, which is run by this cult organization where people are dying and they want to know what's happening from outside the city. Other cities around want to know what's happening, so they send her in. And what she finds at the center of this city is a perfectly beautiful, pure, wonderful angel. And when she arrives there, she realizes that this angel has been sent, and that's what they've been set to do. And at some point, the angel falls in love with her, and or loves her, and can't fulfill what they're doing. And so I like the idea of turning these kind of apocalyptic decisions on their heads. And often for me, love is often the answer to things. Really often, the answer to how to fix something is somehow springing from some kind of love, some kind of nourishing positivity. And I think I keep coming back to that answer in one form or another again. And for me, the answer isn't a big answer, T with a capital T, truth with a capital T, or it's always glimpses of truth, glimpses of beauty, glimpses of kindness and compassion. That's always the answer somehow in what I'm writing. And I'm always making a journey from my question to hope. In everything that I've ever written, that's the kind of arc of journey. And I always know what the end will be. I don't know what the end physically will happen. I know what it will feel like. I know a character. I knew right from the very beginning that Elspeth, even though I didn't know how many books it was going to take, I didn't know that Elspeth, I knew that Elspeth would be alone at some point towards the end, that she would be carrying something. I knew that she would have achieved something, but also be kind of broken as well. And I knew what the feeling would be like in her at the end. And I wrote towards that feeling always. So there was a definite sort of sense of purpose, but it was to an emotional resolution rather than a physical one. So I think all the world building for me is just reflective of that emotional journey. That's probably the best way I can put it.
So it's like, it sounds to me like it's not intentional for you. You just let it flow through you. Is that what it feels
I
like?
do. I think it becomes into, I'm really interested in what goes on inside the character's mind and heart. Like if you think about it, there are three journeys we make, three,
Yeah.
minimum three. One is
Yeah.
the physical journey the character makes. One
Mhm.
is the emotional journey the character makes. So the journey can be to the supermarket, and the emotional journey can be to leave the husband. So it can be a vast emotional journey, but a small physical one. And then
Mm.
there's the spiritual journey, which
Mhm.
they share with the reader, that feeling of transformation that happens when you read, that feeling of movement through your own kind of and development of your own self that
Mhm.
comes. So I think those three journeys happen, and
Mhm.
some of that can be expressed in the landscape and in the world,
Mhm.
and in what the world looks like. So for me, writing Over Newton, an apocalyptic world was what I felt like I'd moved into, a world devoid of many of the things that I'd cared about, a world that was forever changed, a world that was dangerous, unjust, and full of danger. That's what the world felt to me like then. And so when people say to me, oh, the world felt really real, it's because the emotions that produce the world are very real. And
Mm.
so the world rises up out of that. So when I mentor people, I often get them to do these exercises where, they have a character experiencing something, and then I try to get them to invent the world out of that moment rather than inventing it separately. Otherwise, it's like a board with, pawns moving around on it, and you're not connected to it. The world was created kind of mechanically and separately, and therefore you have a really big world, and you've got to decide where your characters go instead of being inside your characters, looking at the world as they make their decisions out of their eyes. So I think
Mhm.
I only know it from readers who said it feels real to them when I'm writing worlds. And I'm often asked to give talks on world building, which, I then end up saying pretty much what I'm saying at the moment, which is
Yeah.
I don't do it with maps
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
genealogies. I would
Mhm.
be as overwhelmed as you are when you think about it.
Mhm. Mhm. That's interesting. Um, I've got more burning questions that I want to ask you. However, I'm also mindful that you have a travel day today, and you said before 8 o'clock, and it's 8 o'clock. So, are you out
Yeah,
of time now? Yeah.
almost. But if you want
Yeah.
to ask
Okay.
another question,
All right.
I've
Well,
got
I'll
another four
maybe just
minutes.
try and do it in 5 minutes if I can. So, the I'm going to finish with a big question, so I'll ask a couple more questions to start with. Um, so another interesting thing that you said was that you don't write for audience, and I don't think you write for money either, do you? That's something that comes, but I definitely through this conversation and through other interviews that I've listened to you give, that's never been a focus for you. And so it's just something that, so is writing and creativity for you a way for you to answer questions, to understand yourself and to understand the world that you're living in? Is that your motivation, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm often asked by kids. Sorry, I'm often asked by kids. I'm sorry, I'll just switch that right down and stop it ringing. I'm often asked by kids, um, when will you retire?
Yeah.
And I say, well, when I stop breathing. I can't
Yeah.
imagine not
Yeah.
writing. I mean, maybe people won't read it someday. Maybe my voice will become, you know, something about my voice will become old. I mean, I've read writers where I could see the arc of their life of a writer was coming to an end, not their life, but they were starting to repeat themselves. And it's
Mhm.
true that you do have big questions you return to over and over again. It's why writers go to the same kind of character set, the same kind of
Mhm.
thing, because they're the big questions of their life that will never really be answered. And they're
Mhm.
the ones that they should attend to, and it's right for them to attend to. But
Mhm.
every now and again, you find a writer. I've got a friend who, quite regretfully, an elderly writer I like very much. Um, and I think she's right that she writes children's books, and her voice is she doesn't understand digital material. She doesn't, and she's sort of herself moved away from the world, and that's
Mhm.
reflected in her writing. So while I love her earlier stuff, I can see now she's lost, and she would need to find something to write about. I think she should write about her own life now. I think that would be really interesting for her.
Mhm.
Maybe I'll even tell her that. But so I think you can come to the end. But for me, I just don't think, I'm 67 now. No, I'm almost 67. I, I, I don't feel any less. I'm so full of stories that if I write a story a year till 100, I won't run out of the ideas I already have. I don't even have to have any new ideas. And the world is so interesting and so vital and so damaged and so hurt that there's so many things to think about. And after this many years and this many books, I feel like it's also a habit, which is
Mm,
great. Because when you've written a lot of books, when you sit down to do something, you just know you can write a book and finish it. And that alone can get you through the hard bits where you think, this is never going to end. For me, it's sometimes like I've got 100,000, you
mm,
know, words and I know I've got to bring it down and it's unwieldy and it's bits here and bits there and I know that doesn't match and this is
mm,
too much and I feel really overwhelmed sometimes just by the amount of words I've written, which I now have to work on and bring down. So that's
Do
the hard
you
bit.
have an editor that does all your editing, or do you do a lot of your own editing before you give it to an editor?
I do a lot of my own editing, but then I also do a lot of editing with editors. I really value them. I don't show my work to anybody else. I wouldn't burden them with that. And
Mm-hmm.
also I don't want anyone messing with my
Mm,
mind because the answers, that's
mm,
why I loathe AI, because it can
mm,
only come up with its own mechanical answers, in which case if someone asks it the same question, it'll give the same answer.
mm,
So I don't want someone's idea. I hate being offered word choice on these
mm.
revolting apps that produce it for me, which I cannot switch off. I
Yeah,
hate them because
yeah.
they get it. Thank God I write pen and paper first
Mm,
because that nothing can get in the way. But that stuff that offers you answers or corrects you,
yeah,
screw you. Excuse me. I don't
yeah.
want you. Go
Mm,
away and leave me alone. Let me have my own thoughts and ideas. Let me make my mistakes because they're
mm,
interesting and they
mm,
lead me in different directions. I don't want
mm,
any of that stuff. And
mm.
as a tutor at university when I was doing my PhD, you can recognize it 100 miles away when someone's got that because it's adjacent to, not causal. So the thing comes up with ideas that are adjacent to one another rather than
Yeah,
properly causal. And you can
yeah.
feel it
Okay.
when you're,
Yeah.
especially when you're a writer, you can
Mm-hmm.
feel that flow through just simply isn't there.
Mm,
Or they're extremely bad writers.
yeah,
Maybe their mind works that way.
yeah,
So yeah, for me and money, I laughed when you said about money because I've
yeah.
never been ever practical. I only accept work if I need to pay a bill. And that's my whole life long. There's feast and famine. I live on the edge of precarity. I run
Yeah,
out of money and
yeah.
when I run out, I mean, I have $30 in the bank and I'm thinking,
Mm,
oh, I better get some money from somewhere. And
yeah,
luckily, I will ring an agency and say, does anyone want me to speak? Can you get me a school?
yeah,
Does a school
yeah,
want me?
yeah, yeah.
And then I enjoy the interactions
Mm,
because I don't do them anywhere near as much as I used to.
mm,
And so money is only there to sort of keep me alive so I can
yeah,
write, not. And
yeah,
I remember John Marsden years ago saying to me, why don't you, like we were really good friends.
yeah,
And he said to me, why don't you write another sequel to The Gathering? And I was
yeah,
horrified. And I
yeah,
said, what? No, there's no sequel to that. And he said, what do
yeah.
you mean? There'll be one if you write it. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, well, I can't because that
Mm,
story is itself.
mm,
There's
mm,
nothing more. So things don't, you can't sequel things. Like the book that I've just
mm,
written, the questions that I asked when I was writing that book are even more strongly in me now with more nuance. So I know I need to write a sequel to that book. And I just broke the news with some trepidation to the publishers saying, how would you feel if and I was amazed how happy they were,
oh,
where I thought
good.
they might be
Yeah.
saying, oh, come on, you've promised,
Mm,
because I have so many contracts that I haven't fulfilled yet and
mm,
people waiting for them that
yeah.
I know I need to do these other books as well, but
Mm,
sometimes just things just won't be pushed down. So I was
mm,
really glad that my child, which was going to come anyway, will
yes.
have a nice reception.
Wow, Isabel, I just want to say that I really admire you for the choices that you've made in your life. I also heard you talk in one interview about right at the start where you decided not to pursue a career in journalism and you raised $3,000 so that you could have the freedom to go and write. And I really admire you for that because I feel like I had a point in my life where um, I I could have chosen to go into the arts, and instead I went into the business world. And because I felt like I needed to have security, I probably also felt like I needed to have some material accomplishment because I was probably a bit, focused on what the world thought about me and what social expectation was. And I have a lot of regrets around that. And now, where I am in life and I reflect back on it, I realize that that stuff is not really important. Like being secure and being able to put a roof over your head. And I've also got 2 kids. And so being able to look after them, that's important. But that you don't need a lot of money, and to have time to be creative and to not have deadlines and, you need to do this because someone's paying you to do it. I really admire you for choosing differently and creating that for yourself, because yeah, I just think that that is important and that is valuable. So that's not a question, that's just paying you some homage. And I
But
just am
Leonie,
going to.
you're so young. You are so young and you have so much time. And I think that security that you
Yeah.
needed is really important. But for me, it was grounded in writing. I feel safe when I'm writing. I don't feel very safe in the world. And I don't think money is going to stop. I think it's that break that happened when I was young, my dad dying. I didn't think the world would ever be safe. And that the only thing that made me feel safe was this world I could create with my words. So I think we do need that in order to write. And also, it may be that the kind of work you're going to do and are doing as a writer required you to live that life beforehand. And you now have that security to stand on where, my life is still, I've spent a week just applying for a fellowship for the second time. And because, the guys there told me nobody gets it the first time. So I thought, well, I only applied once before, so maybe I'm not the kind of writer to get it. And there's just this precarity of life, which is always going to be there. And so that's not fun, it's either. It's not great to be that way. But at the same time, I do think that, you know, it makes me a better human being and a better writer to be not quite safe. One of the reasons I travel is because I feel uncertain, I feel anxious, I feel scared a lot of the time when I'm traveling. Once I reach a spot like this, which I really love, I'm very tempted just to stop traveling and stay. But I will push myself on because that's what I've decided to do. And because in those, oh, for crying out loud, in those moments of being frightened and um, it's when you just know what you're made of, when you face, oh my God, it's the middle of the night, I missed that train, what am I going to do now? And that really deep feeling of, that's when you're most connected to other human beings, that super vulnerability. So on the one hand, we need security. You can't write if you're hungry, if you don't have somewhere to sit and write. So just the practicalities of writing require a certain level of something, but also what connects you to human beings of all the struggles. And one of the struggles you've gone through as a writer, I can already tell, is that longing to write. When you chose a path out of, honor and practicalities, you chose a different path, but it called to you anyway. And maybe that the distance between, I really believe in this, the distance between what we long for and the moment of attaining it is this beautiful tension, which is when we are at our finest as human beings. And if instant gratification, the problem with that, I want this, here it is, I'll have this. The problem with that is we don't feel this beautiful thread of yearning. And that I see it in you in this interview, that yearning to write. And I have it too. And I think, having that yearning is important. And maybe your life required that divergence in order to stretch you into that yearning that will, all of everything you've done will pour into your writing now. So, and you have plenty of years left.
Oh, thank you, Isobelle. That's so encouraging. I have one more question, if you'll allow me. So it's a big one. Um, and I know that you already use your writing to, explore meaning. So it is, where did we come from? What are we doing here? And where are we going?
Where do we come from? Well, I think we come out of gentle darkness and we go into gentle darkness. I think we're surrounded by it. I don't want to die. I'm frightened of dying. I don't want to stop. I think it would be so boring not to know what's going to happen next.
Mhm.
So I think life is just really about paying attention and finding ways to be really, really, oh, this is such a boring word, present. And
Mm.
I think it's really, And it's these things we do. It's this constant search for that feeling of connectedness with life. So, you know, if you go to the beach and it's cold and you get in the water and your body then adjusts and the sun comes out, and for a moment you feel this almost ecstasy, and all the difficulties of getting there in that moment are rewarded by these moments of absolute connectedness and presence. And for me, writing is one of the ways to reach that state. Reading also, and looking at art and living in the world. So I think these moments that when I'm traveling and I'm not able to write and I really want to, are really important too, because they're filling up the coffers with new material, with other people's thoughts and ideas. And in the gap and the space between wanting to write and not being able to write, all this rich stuff is happening that will go into the writing in the end anyway. So for me, I don't know what came before. I know I'll go into it again at the end, but while I'm here, hell, I am going to be here. So that's the best I can say. And my pen will keep me here.
Oh, thanks, Isobelle. Well, I think that's the full stop at the end of a really fantastic interview. So thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure
I really
to
enjoyed it.
connect with
Sorry
you
about the
again.
noises.
No, I actually can't hear any background noise. So yeah, I think you must have been referring to your phone alarm. I also couldn't hear that. So no, it was good, and I'm glad that the connection ended up being really good. Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
Well,
It did. After a shaky beginning,
yeah,
like writing.
yeah, that's right. Well, enjoy the rest of your travels. I'll send you this recording, and I'll send you also the transcript if you want it. And I'll write up a blog entry, and I'll share it with you when it's done. And if
That
you
would be
would you
great.
like me to run a draft by you before I publish
Not at
anything?
all.
No.
No, no,
Okay.
I will be absolutely fine. But I hope you don't mind.
Okay.
I have a little Patreon group. This is one of the ways I fill the gap. I have a little
Yeah.
Patreon page. Do you
Yeah.
mind if I share that? It's not very many people.
Absolutely. I would
And
love to support you. Yes.
it's not public facing. It's just
Yeah.
inside to my people, to my
Yeah,
patrons. That's
absolutely.
okay with you?
I
Okay,
would
great.
love to share that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and join it
Because it
actually.
was a
So,
good interview. I really enjoyed it
yeah.
too.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks, Isobelle. All right. Well, I hope you have a good transit day.
Me too. And perhaps in another 15 years, we'll
Well,
talk again.
hopefully not. Where do you live now? Are you in Queensland now?
I'm in Queensland quite a lot of the time. I still have my
Yeah.
house on the Gold Ocean Road, so
Yeah.
that's where I don't seem to live anywhere particularly
Mm,
anymore. I travel a lot, you know.
yeah.
So, but
Okay.
Queensland, I'm a lot there
Yeah.
now.
Okay. Well, I'm on the Sunshine Coast now. I did used to be
Oh,
Victoria. Yeah. So,
maybe we'll have
yeah.
a coffee
Yeah,
sometime.
let's
Yeah, I'd
have a
love
coffee
that.
sometime.
Yeah, that'd be good.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
Isobelle.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.